Hello again. I'm back with another drawing. It is another pastel portrait. Previously, I drew Thanos from the Marvel Universe as I continue to work on my pastel skills. Once again, I've chosen a Marvel Universe character, this time Gamora. I'm using the 36 set of Mungyo Gallery Oil Pastels and some Canson pastel paper. I'm working with the rough side of the paper. I decided to start with the eyes and use the Faber-Castell Classic color pencils for this, but I found they just don't work that well with the pastel paper, so I switched to Prismacolor Premiers, which are a much softer pencil, and these work a little bit better. So any pencils you see me using later in the drawing are Prismacolor Premiers from the 48 set. Once the eyes are sketched in, I then start to apply the pastels to the hair. So unlike pencil crayons or color pencils, once you start applying the pastels, you really lose all evidence of any reference lines that you may have sketched in. So I generally keep a reference image handy, and I use this. And I use the reference lines more in an attempt to contain the pastels. Because of this, I don't really expect my final result to look exactly like the reference. This is more for developing skills and having a bit of fun. For the hair, I use a variety of the red-orange colors, including carmine, scarlet, and vermilion. Some areas I've added touches of flame red, orange, golden yellow, and even yellow. For the browns, I'm using the russet, the brown, and the raw umber, and the darkest areas I've added black. For blending, once again, I've gone with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. This works very well for blending the pastels. I do work with this in a well-ventilated room. While working with the paint thinner, I generally don't clean the brush, so I tend to work in bands of color, often from the lighter ones and then to the darkened ones. I don't always follow that pattern, but that's what I try to stick to. One thing I do notice with the pastels and using the paint thinner, or just blending the pastels in general, is that once you have a darkened, or once you've darkened up a section, it isn't that easy to lighten it. And because of this, it's probably best to aim for a tone lighter than what you want, and then darken if you need to. Some areas of the hair I attempted to lighten or brighten with orange or yellow, and in some cases white. But once the red or brown was laid down, it was hard to lighten effectively. You almost ended up with a blended result rather than a layered result. Of course, you can always attempt to scrape off what you already have on there. I tend to, I'm not one of the eraser types, so I tend to just add layers rather than subtract them. This is the fourth time I've used these pastels and the Canson pastel paper. I believe I've finally come to the realization that I don't like the paper. The paper is quite rough with textured dots on it, which I'm sure makes sense for working with pastels. But for the drawings I'm doing, I don't layer the pastel on that thick, and hence always end up seeing the textured dots in the final result. It's not that big of a deal. At arm's length, you probably would never notice these dots, but I think I will give watercolor paper a try on my next pastel drawing. I have some cold press watercolor paper that has lots of texture and is quite durable. The watercolor paper may also be better suited for applying colored pencil for any detailed areas. I sped things up a bit here, but the reality is using pastels goes a lot quicker than colored pencils. It would be nice if I could hammer out one of these drawings in 30 minutes, but 3 to 5 hours is a little more realistic. Again, a huge time savings over the 15 plus hours for a colored pencil drawing. I spend a considerable amount of time on the hair One reason I do spend so much time is that I tend to be a bit too conservative when applying the pastel. You clearly do not need to apply a thick layer of pastel, but you do need to apply enough to cover the paper and attempt to fill in the dots. In many cases, when I start to apply the paint thinner, I realize I just haven't added enough pastel. I find there tends to be a sweet spot between having not enough and having too much. When I'm applying the oil pastel, I tend to push fairly hard, and I notice that once you start getting little bits forming around the pastel stick, then I know I have applied enough. Clearly you don't want a bunch of pastel flakes on the paper because these things will smear and smudge quite nicely. You just want to apply enough pastel to the point where the stick itself is starting to scrape or remove what you've already laid down. Now, disclaimer here, I will point out that this is my 4th pastel drawing. I'm not counting any that I did when I was 5. I am far from an expert. I'm simply saying what works for me as a beginner. I strongly urge you to check out other pastel artists on YouTube, but keep in mind that these are oil pastels and not chalk pastels. I find there are plenty of good chalk pastel artists. I don't come across many who work with oil pastels. If you know of any, feel free to throw in a comment down below. As things progress with the hair, you may see that I try to lighten some sections up with very limited success. The pastel colors are very intense, and once you have the color down, even using white or yellow doesn't lighten it up too much, especially if you blend it in. The pastels are soft enough that you can just apply the lighter color over top. At this point, I'm starting to be a bit more comfortable with how these pastels apply. So finishing up the hair goes a little bit quicker. Onto the face. Here I'm using greens, blues, and white. Yellow green and jade green were the most prominent. Turquoise blue was also used, and I blended in some lemon yellow. Malachite green and emerald green are used for some of the shaded areas. For the face, I'm using the paint thinner to blend in the larger areas, but I'm using blending stumps for some of the details. I also use the Prismacolor Premier pencils to either fill in or essentially use as a blending stump, a colored blending stump. With the 48 set of Prismacolor Premiers, I really don't have any issues trying to match up the colors with the pastels, and they also match up quite nicely in intensity. Once the face is done, the rest of the drawing goes fairly quickly. I also decide to throw in a background, and I specifically choose a color that I feel I'm less likely to use in the future. So at some point I'll probably find out that my choice of background colors were poor selections. Now the topic was Gamora. I did see the Avengers Endgame. It took me a few weeks to get in to see it with my kids, and that was simply because the show was usually sold out. In some ways, I enjoyed Infinity War and Age of Ultron better. I think that's simply because you've got a movie with so many characters and you've got to deal with them all in 3 hours. But they did do a good job of wrapping things up. Speaking of wrapping things up, I'm almost finished here. I should mention we are into baseball season. Both of my sons have tried out for their respective travel summer ball teams. Likely I will spend the next 2 months traveling around the province and not spending much time drawing. I do hope to get in some time drawing, but at best I will upload a video a month for the next little while. I will have my camera with me, hoping to get some nice reference images to work with. Anyway, thank you for watching, and feel free to subscribe if you haven't already done so.